Hello, everyone, and welcome. Let me start off by saying Malay Vanakkam, which means good evening in my native language of Tamil, and Selamat Petang and Selamat Datang, which means good evening and welcome in my national language of Bahasa Malaysia. I just want to say thank you all so much for joining us on this day. Today is Sunday, the 9th of October, 2022, and is our concluding day of the Global Tribunal of Women Workers held during the Global South Women's Forum 2022. I would just like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Pravin Premnath, and I am the Communications Officer at ERA Asia Pacific, as well as a member of the Global Tribunal Organizing and Core team. And I will be co-facilitating this event and this session today, along with my wonderful colleague, Vivi. Hi, Vivi.
Hi, Pravin, and hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Global Tribunal of Women Workers. And thank you so much for joining us this evening or morning or afternoon from your end.
Thank you, Vivi. All right, if you could just give me 2 minutes of your time to quickly walk everyone through our virtual housekeeping rules, that would be great. All right. So once again, everyone, welcome to the Global South Women's Forum 2022. When this year we have done something very different for us, and we have hosting the Global Tribunal of Women Workers. So these are the virtual housekeeping rules. We have interpretation available for this session. I have sent on the chat the different interpretation languages as well as the channels. I'm actually very sorry. I think I've sent a outdated version. So if you could just give me a quick minute to send a correct version, that would be great. Apologies. All right. So this session provides interpretation. To access interpretation, please select the globe menu that you see on the bottom of your screen on the Zoom menu, and please choose the language channel that you wish to listen in. So for this session, we have Bahasa Malaysia. To access Bahasa Malaysia interpretation, please select the German channel. We also have Vietnamese interpretation. To access Vietnamese, please select the Korean channel. We also have Bahasa Indonesia interpretation. To access Bahasa Indonesia, please select the Chinese channel. We have Bangla interpretation. To access Bangla, please select the Russian channel. We also have Thai interpretation. To access Thai, please select the Japanese channel. And we have Filipino or Tagalog interpretation. To access Filipino, please select the Portuguese channel. We also have Spanish, Arabic, French. That is a language I am missing on the chat. Sorry, apologies. We also have Spanish, Arabic, French, Urdu, Nepali, Khmer, and Tamil, which are all available on their respective channels. So thank you all so much. And please do select and stay in your respective language channels to ensure that you can hear the interpretation. I'm just updating the language channels in the chat. My apologies for that. And yes, so I've sent the updated version in the chat. Thank you. So once you're in your language channels, you can select mute original audio to only hear the interpreter. ERA Asia Pacific is committed to making this an inclusive and safe digital environment, and will not tolerate harassment of any kind, including but not limited to deliberate intimidation and sustained disruption of discussion. Participants are obliged to be respectful and refrain from replicating societal prejudices and inequalities. Participants who engage in disruptive behavior may be muted or removed without prior notice. This session is being hosted in a webinar format. So we do have the public chat box as well as a Q&A box on the Zoom webinar. So please feel free to use both these functions and spaces to interact with each other, as well as to interact with the speakers for today. This session is also being live streamed on ERA Asia Pacific's YouTube channel, Twitter page, as well as our Facebook page. The recording will be made publicly afterwards. Thank you so much for letting me walk you through our housekeeping rules. Before we officially start the session, I would just like to invite everyone to very quickly watch our brief yet powerful video that we created for the Global Tribunal of Women Workers. This video was produced by Kobe Media. And so I'm just inviting our tech team to help us share and play that video. So please do have a watch and enjoy.
Unite with forgotten women workers against exploitation and discrimination. Join the movement and demand equality for millions of women to work and live with dignity. Join forces with us this September at the Global South Women's Forum. Be involved and help amplify their voices to demand justice from powerful actors.
Right. Thank you so much for watching the video with us. And thank you so much, Pravin, for the introduction and also such a lovely opening. And again, I just would like to say hi. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And welcome back, like I mentioned, to the Global Tribunal of Women Workers. And welcome to our final day of the Global Tribunal, which is the day of the recommendations. As Pravin mentioned, and I think we all know that from the 24th up to 28th of September 2022, we had the 5 days of hearing sessions of the Global Tribunal. And during those days, we heard more than 70 testimonies from women workers from more than 20 countries in the Global South. Those 5 days, I feel like it has transformed into a space where women workers' experiences and also their struggles has become the center of our conversations and ultimately the centers of our advocacy to demand justice. And today, after weeks of deliberations, we will hear recommendations from our jury working group's members. However, before we hear the recommendations from our jury working group members, I would like for us to also take, this is definitely more than a minute of video, but this is basically a video that will show you the recap of the 5 days of the hearing sessions preceding, and to also formally to say thank you to all witnesses that has joined the Global Tribunal for your bravery, for sharing your story with us. I think without further ado, I would just like to give the space to our tech team from Structive 8 to share the video with all of us. The space is yours. Thank you.
Rewriting our own history, when it is so painful, sometimes seems like suicidal. I felt an icy cold throughout my body and fear spread on my chest. I tried in every possible way to prevent him from taking off my pants and underwear. I tried to struggle with all my strength so that he wouldn't touch me or get close to my body. But the other buddies arrived to finish sinking me into disgrace. I was barely 26 years old and my life was undone by 3 scums. I returned to reality, to the unfortunate reality that awaited me. And while undergoing the legal medicine exam, which has been a second rape, in this case a fourth, I wondered if it had been my fault. Unfortunately, that's what raped women like me believe at first. Did I put on the wrong blouse? Was it because of the skirt? Did my clothes reveal more than they should? A rape is not a fist or a blow. It is a crime that destroys our lives.
সমাজে যেগুলো প্রবলেম রয়েছে সেগুলোর জন্য আমরা পড়াশোনা থেকে বঞ্চিত রয়েছি এবং কর্মস্থানের কোনো ঠিক নেই, আমাদের বাসস্থানের কোনো ঠিক নেই। আমরা রাস্তার সাথে রেল লাইনের মধ্যে বাসা বেঁধে থাকি সবাই। একদিন খাই তো 2 দিন খাওয়ার পাই না, কারণ আমাদের মূল প্রবলেমটাই হয়েছে হলো গিয়া দারিদ্রতা। আর আমাদের নারীদেরকে অনেক ভোগান্তিতে ভুগতে হয়, জরায়ু মুখে ক্যান্সার, এরকম বিভিন্ন মারাত্মক রোগ থেকে তারা নিজেদেরকে করছে, অনেকে মারা যাচ্ছে, হাজার হাজার শিশু মারা যাচ্ছে গর্ভহীন অবস্থায়, নারীরা মারা যাচ্ছে, মৃত্যুর সাথে মোকাবেলা করছে তারা। তো আমরা এটাই চাই সরকারের কাছে, আমাদের আবেদন এটাই যে আমরা জানি আমাদের অধিকার থেকে বঞ্চিত না হই, আমাদের শিশুরা যেন নিজের অধিকার ফিরে পায়, তারা যেন উচ্চ লেভেলে গিয়ে চাকরি করতে পারে, পড়াশোনা করতে পারে, তাদের স্বপ্ন পূরণ করতে পারে, তাদের লক্ষ্য নিয়ে তারা বেঁচে থাকতে পারে এবং তাদের স্বপ্নটা যেন তারা পূরণ করতে পারে। আর প্রয়োজন সরকার, আমাদের নেতা যারা বড় লেভেলে আছে তাদেরকে ভাবার প্রয়োজন। আমরাও মানুষ, আমাদেরও বাঁচার অধিকার আছে, আমাদেরও খোলা ভাবে না, আমাদের জীবন মান নিয়ে কেউ ভাবে না, আমাদের জীবন মান উন্নয়ন নিয়ে কেউ ভাবে না, কিছু জীবনযাপন করতে পারে আর তারাও যেন গর্বের সাথে বলতে পারে জন্ম আমার ধন্য হলো মা।
Di mana di situ kondisi kerja yang membuat saya harus memutuskan kontrak kerja saya. Saya di majikan tersebut harus bekerja dari jam 5 pagi, kadang hingga jam 11 malam. Dan harus berbelanja keluar, kemudian harus memijat orang tua, bahkan memijat dalam waktu yang sangat panjang. Di mana di situ saya merasa terlalu panjang dalam jam kerja saya, kemudian saya sangat capek, dan saya waktu itu kan pas musim COVID di Hong Kong itu saya tidak pernah difasilitasi oleh majikan tentang perlengkapan untuk pencegahan COVID-19. Jadi saya harus membeli semuanya sendiri. Ketika menerima kabar bahwa saya tidak diberikan visa bekerja lagi di Hong Kong, saya merasa sangat bingung karena saya di situ belum siap untuk pulang kembali ke Indonesia karena saya termasuk tulang punggung keluarga dan saya mempunyai anak dan juga saya harus membiayai kehidupan keluarga saya.
However, our workplaces were kept closed and we were without an income for a total of 581 days. We sent 4 open letters to the Prime Minister. We came together, over 100 of us, to demand food supplies from local government. We protested twice to submit our demands. We ran a campaign where 200 sex workers sent their high-heeled shoes in the mail, just attached, demanding they take responsibility. I am considered a criminal for doing sex work, but what other job is available for an Indigenous woman without capital or qualifications?
ๆที่เราเผชิญในฐานะคนทำงานในอู่หนึ่งบ้านคือค่าแรงต่ำและอันตรายจากการทำงานแม้จะทำงานทั้งวันแต่ค่าตอบแทนน้อยมากซึ่งไม่เพียงพอที่จะเลี้ยงดูครอบครัวไม่มีการพักผ่อนเพราะฉันใช้เวลาว่างทั้งหมดไปกับการทำอวนเราทำงานประมาณ12ชั่วโมงต่อวันฉันมีอาการปวดหลังและไหล่ติดไม่สามารถยกขึ้นได้จากการนั่งทำงานเป็นเวลานานๆนอกจากนี้ฉันยังมีอาการปวดเจ็บที่นิ้วซึ่งนี่คือปัญหาอาชีวะอนามัยผู้หญิงในหมู่บ้านที่ทำแหอวนจับปลาประสบปัญหาสุขภาพระหว่างตั้งครรภ์เช่นโลหิตจางและเมื่อคลอดลูกเด็กเกิดมาพร้อมกับปัญหาสุขภาพในปี 2547 กรมควบคุมโรคได้มาตรวจร่างกายและพบว่าระดับตะกั่วในเลือดของพวกเราสูงกว่าปกติแต่กระนั้นก็ไม่มีการดำเนินการใดๆจนในปีผู้รับงานไปทำที่บ้านก็เป็นคนงานเช่นกันและมีสิทธิ์ที่จะได้รับการดูแลทางการแพทย์และสิทธิประโยชน์จากประกันสังคม
And I never talked to anyone. I was fearing to lose my job. This is my first time now when I'm speaking out. Every one of us have some memories in life. Some of the memories we want to forget, especially the sad and hurtful happening to us. It's not easy. In 2007, I got pregnant and it was difficult to tell them because I was also fearing to lose my job. But I was not having a choice, but I have to tell my madam. And she was totally not happy that I'm pregnant at that moment because she felt that if I have to go visit my clinic, what will happen to her household? She started complaining and writing on a daily basis. I needed the job and my kids needed my support at the same time. I kept on working and I did not attend to some of my doctor's appointments for years. My moral and my immune system and my interest for work showed down. She started pressurizing me for working until late, sometimes until 9, sometimes I need to overnight there and I left my kids alone at home. I'm sorry, Shana. My relationship at home, my relationship with my kids, it was also not good because I realized and I came to realize that sometimes I used to take this stress from workplace and I bring it back home. I want to participate in this community program. Working with young girls that's going through difficult times is the same one that I went through where I did not realize it was a reality. To assist women in or at least to be a shoulder to another person or to be a mentor and motivate them to speak out. To speak out is a healing process from inside out and building confidence in someone's life, of either for me myself.
Most of the issues raised by domestic workers are no days off. Passport being held by employers, some cannot send monies to their families directly. There are also incidents of verbal abuse among domestic workers, and food is not enough for a day work. There are also times that domestic workers sleep with the employer's kids beside them, which is supposed to be the rest time. The reason why the need to organize domestic workers. I can feel the fear and worry among domestic workers because they do not want to deport it in our country. Majority said that it would be better that they keep quiet and not to join any organization that advocates workers' rights.
In general, the workers are vulnerable in many ways. They are mostly B40 women, single mother, sole breadwinners, and have had less formal education. They are being exploited and their rights are denied due to fixed term contract system which does not guarantee job security. This situation affects all workers. However, women workers are particularly vulnerable because they become bonded laborers. When we stand together with the women workers and protest with them, authorities arrest us, mistreat us in the lockup. We were forced into Black Maria with no social distancing during the COVID-19, and we were handcuffed and the police shouted at us, "Oh, jangan pising, don't shout. Gampang, that means we are children of outback." And then bising macam binatang, shouting like animal.
Olambanga bana nenkolerayoku myaka gyange nga gisoba mu 2 naye sifunyeemu nengezaako okubanja nentuuka nennemererwa nga nina abaana sirina kyembaliisa obubaka wempa gavumenti. Naffe abali wansi abanaku batujjukirenga bwe tuba tuukiridde batuyambe obuzibu bwaffe, kubanga ekitugaana ogendayo tetulina busobozi. Ogendayo ne bakuvuluga ne bakussa wansi. Ate naye obubaka bwempa abakozi twemalira nnyo ku mirimu gyaffe nga tugyagala, naye ate netuwunzika nga ffe tetukoze ekyo, tetufunyeemu. Naffe batufeeko, tumala obudde bwaffe n'amaanyi gaffe ne tukola, naye ne bakola ki? Ne tuwunzika nga tebatulabye nti tubadde bakozi. Oli mukozi ku ssaawa eno, nkya bw'ovaawo oba tukyali mukozi.
ඉතින් ඒ ආයතනය ටික කාලයක් යනකොට ඕඩර්ස් නැති වෙලා අපිට වැඩ කරන්න ඕඩර් නැතුව ටිකෙන් ටික ආයතන වැහෙන තත්ත්වයකට පත් වුණා. ඊට පස්සේ මම කොග්ගල ස්ත්‍රී මධ්‍යස්ථානයත් එක්ක සම්බන්ධ වෙලා හිටියා. එහිදී මම ඒ සම්බන්ධ වෙලා ඉන්නකොට මම ඒ කාංචනා සොයරියට ගිහින් කිව්වා මෙන්න මෙහෙම ප්‍රශ්නයක් තියෙනවා අපිට. මොකද මේකට කරන්නේ අපේ ළමයි 1500 ගණනක් ඉන්නවා. තුමිය අපිට කිව්වා ඔයගොල්ලෝ වෘත්තීය සමිතියක් හදන්න. එතකොට ওই ප්‍රශ්න විසඳ ගන්න පුළුවන්. ප්‍රශ්න ගොඩක් මුහුණ දෙන්න සිද්ධ වුණා.
Thank you everyone for watching the recap video. And I also would like to say thank you for the Jakarta Feminist Associations that has helped us compiling this very powerful video that we just watched. And once again, thank you for all the witnesses and also the collaborators for your contributions to the Global Tribunal. And finally, to formally open today's sessions of the Day of Recommendations, I would like to invite, I think everybody knows her, Shanti Opreti, our program managers of IRO Asia Pacific, and the person who has been leading the core team of the Global Tribunal that made this whole space happen. Everyone, I would like to you to also welcome Sun with me, and Sun, the space is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vivi. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So like those 5 days, today is another important day. And we are going to listen to the recommendations from the jury working group members after listening to those 73 testimonies from the workers around the world. So I'm going to very briefly share, because this experience, I think, for us as an organizer, as core team members, it was a little different, and in some ways it was overwhelming at times, and it was also inspiring. So I'm going to kind of share our collective reflection of my team on how we were thinking about the whole process. And also, I hope that will also provide little context to those who were not able to join us for other 5 days. And that will also help us to make connections to the recommendations that we are going to listen from the jury working group members later today. So I'm going to read my statement for today. It's around 10 minutes. It wasn't easy going to bed, listening to all those hurtful stories of women workers and recollecting yourself next morning to get ready for another day. But in all this exhausting state, what kept us going was the hope for dignified life for women who testified, and many more women who couldn't be with us to tell their stories in those 5 days. The realization of how badly we have failed these women as a society, as a movement collectively, wasn't easy to process. We presented 73 testimonies of women workers from 21 countries, representing domestic workers, garment workers, electronic and other factory workers, sex workers, indigenous workers, transgender workers, cleaners and sweepers from Dalit community, healthcare workers, nurses, journalists, women farmers, home-based workers, street vendors, entertainment workers, and a few more. Many women who testified in this global tribunal have very basic demands. Demands to be recognized as workers, demands to be treated humanly, demands to be heard, demands for toilets, medicine, demands for minimum wage, demands to not get raped and abused, demands to be decriminalized, demands to have job contracts, demands to keep their passport with themselves, demands for 1 day off, demands for toxic, chemical, and noise-free working environment, demands to organize themselves, demands to earn living ways to support their family. If we are failing to address basic demands as these, then where do we stand as human race? In those 5 days of hearings from 24th to 28th of September, we heard nothing but injustices committed to our sisters. We heard stories that have never been told before. We heard stories that have been told thousands of times. We heard a story of a mother who lost her child in a factory fire. We heard a story of a migrant worker who was separated from her child the day she gave birth and jailed for being undocumented. We heard a story of Dalit cleaners who are asking for society's approval to open a tea shop so that they can better support their family. We also heard many stories of domestic workers who are abused by their employers and the agents. We heard stories of sex workers who are simply asking to be decriminalized. We heard stories of factory workers demanding a toxic chemical-free environment. We heard stories of dancers and singers who are persecuted by the authorities for following the profession of their passion and culture. We heard stories of hospital cleaners who are denied the right to unionize. We can go on and on to tell you what we heard, but we will not do so because you don't listen. In many instances, the system doesn't even know these women exist. So don't ask for more evidence. If you choose to be ignorant, nothing can help. Don't ask why we are angry. Our anger is valid, our frustration is justified. Let's talk about the multinational corporations as one of the key perpetrators. We thought we are done with colonization, but no, clearly the global south is all about fulfilling the comfort and greed of the global north through cheap labor and extractivism. And our sisters working in those global supply chains are paying the price for it. It's not that we don't know your intentions, it's just that our governments are too fragile and too ignorant to defend the rights of their own people. And there are people behind these injustices. There are perpetrators or enablers or regulators allowing these injustices to happen. There are individuals, there are families, there are companies, there are agencies, there are brands, police, state agencies, and administration responsible for these injustices. It's time to retrospect our systems, our mindset. It's high time we pay attention to people who are behind everything we consume, from food we eat to clothes we wear, from phones we use to services we get. How many more testimony and evidence do we need to understand that these women have been ill-treated, violated, discriminated, ignored, invisibilized? Who gets to decide what is work? Who should be considered as workers? If a person who works 12 hours a day as a paid care worker and continues working for another 3-4 hours as an unpaid care worker is not even considered as a worker, then we better reflect on our policies and priorities. If you ask us about the impact of this tribunal, out of 73 witnesses who testified, even if one demand of one witness is addressed, if it brings one witness one step closer in accessing redress and justice, that will be a big win for us. We have been that desperate for justice. It's not that we have raised our demands and expectations. It's just that the system, the governments have maintained very low standards and actions in listening, supporting its most vulnerable people. We will continuously make an effort to visibilize many more women workers, to remind the society and the system to realize that there are millions of invisibilized women workers supporting our daily existence as cleaners, as domestic workers, farmers, and many more, so that we acknowledge, respect, recognize, and fairly remunerate their labor and their agency. To all our sisters with high hopes of this tribunal, we don't have answers to so many questions you asked. What you have asked is what we have also been asking for ages. What we are hopeful about this tribunal is that our fellow feminists and organizations working on women's rights and labor rights will pick up your stories, understand your struggles, forefront your voices, and demand justice from wherever they stand. To all our collaborators, we will need your continued support in this. This would not have happened without you, and we are counting on you moving forward. We would like to thank everyone involved in this initiative in a different capacity. We can't name them all, there are way too many people, but I would like to thank my team, Praveen, Vivi, Priyanti, Paulette, Virginia, our admin and finance team, and the rest of our EROIP gang. Thank you. But this is also a reminder to our team that we have to go a long way keeping up these expectations. Our dearest friend Melona, who is wearing multiple hats in this tribunal, she is also a full-time interpreter for Tagalog, one of our collaborators, and also our organizing committee member. After those 5 days of hearings, Melona wrote to us, "We cried and we are angry. our passion to fight for justice is burning. Thank you from our group and from all our women who gave their witnesses. They are very inspired. Thank you, dear sister. It will guide us for a long time. And thank you everyone for being with us today in solidarity. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shanti. Or, as friends, we refer to Shanti very fondly as San. So thank you so much, San. And echoing San's heartfelt thank yous and gratitude to all of the 73 women workers who testified as witnesses, and to our 28 collaborating organizations, the ERA AP team, my colleagues, and to everyone else who supported this event to make this global event and this workers-led movement a reality. And thank you to everyone sharing your solidarity and love and support in the chat. So I think now we will officially enter the recommendation portion of our event today. So just explaining that our event will be divided into 2 sessions. We will start off with our jury working groups, providing a summary of the issues and cases and testimonies that they received and which were all under their purview, and what they used as a basis to draft and now present their recommendations. After that first session is done and all 5 of our jury working groups have presented their summaries, we will then move on to the second session of today, which is when the jury working groups will officially present their recommendations. With that, I would like to introduce the first jury working group, which is our jury working group on ending gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work. Joining us in this jury working group, we have Jackie Pollock, Wachla Naidu, Sahiba Gill, Sehnaz Kimaz, as well as Prashasti Saxena. With that, I would like to officially and formally welcome Prashasti from the jury working group to present your group's summary. Thank you, and go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much, Pravin and everyone for organizing this. And thank you so much, Shanti, for that very powerful 10 minutes. I think you covered a lot of the things I wanted to convey from the things that we covered in terms of discussions within our jury working group when we were going through the testimonies that we were presented. So but before I move on, I just want to try and thank my jury working group and IRA and everybody that was involved in setting up the tribunal and setting up all your work and supporting us through. So there was a lot of work and support that all my jury working group members put at this tribunal. So I just want to give them a shout out. And this is just my attempt to adequately try and put together the things that we thought were important in terms of what we saw in the trends that we saw within all of the testimonies that were presented, and the kind of common issues and structural barriers that we saw that existed in every country that we found testimonies from, or the relevant states that are involved or in question, from where these migrant women workers come, where they are migrating to, all of them. So I want to give a shout out to Shehnaz, Wachla, Jackie, and Sahiba before I move on. Thank you so much. And they were a heavy 5 days. And as much as I am thankful for this experience, I think it is the collective solidarity of everybody who attended these testimonies in supporting each other in getting through those testimonies that I think leads to the success of this event. So thank you very much, everyone. So getting on to the official summary, we were the jury working group on gender-based violence and harassment at workplaces. So the testimonies that were shared by witnesses about their personal experiences have distinctly highlighted common issues that are faced by women workers, especially when we talk about gender-based violence at workplaces. So the testimonies that were shared by witnesses at the tribunal have clearly shown us how oppressive systems work today and how they work hand in hand towards further exploitation of women and women workers. So all of the obvious things that you would think are obvious and that women have been fighting for years against capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, racism, we think have contributed to the violations that we heard across 73 testimonies shared by the witnesses. And gender-based violence of different forms and perpetuated and intergenerational poverty, we think have been used as tools of these oppressive systems for forcing compliance of women workers to these systems and or to enforce hierarchies and privileges of people that are holding up these systems, that are preventing women workers from getting access to justice, that are preventing them from even speaking up about their experiences. I think that is very, very important to highlight, because this has been an overlap between all of the testimonies that we heard, not just within the testimonies for our thematic group. So within our working group, we tried and analyzed what rights were violated and the impact that they had on survivors. And additionally, we spent some time identifying structural and systematic barriers to justice that we thought were conveyed within all of the testimonies that we had been presented with. So the jury working group has identified commonalities in testimonies which indicate and include the lack of access to justice, lack of provision for care workers, sexual violence, stigmatization of work, especially sex work, and issues for migrant workers that include access to help due to migration laws and ineffective workplace conditions. So the jury working group has then identified that the issues raised under these testimonies have presented under this thematic group. They also have a trend of overlap with other thematic areas. And in the session that goes on later, when Jackie presents a recommendation, we will try and focus on gender-based violence. But I do want to point out what overlap we did see with other working groups. So we saw a trend of overlap with, especially with migration work, decent work, and care work, which was overtly seen within testimonies when concerns were being raised. And then there were some trends or some overlaps that we saw that weren't expressly raised as concerns, but we did think were quite important to be also raised as concerns that overlap with access and awareness to healthcare for women. And I think the important thing to note here is that they weren't considered important enough, or they weren't the first thing that came to the minds of women or others while giving their testimonies, which I think really highlights what kind of basic needs or provisions that are being taken away from women and women workers, that it has been considered as the normal reality of every day, which I think is quite sad and is something that we should be working to solve towards. So in terms of the violation of rights, systematic barriers, and then the gaps in national legislation that we have seen. So the testimonies that were presented to us, they indicate and constitute human and labor rights violations under several international conventions that are binding on the relevant states and addressed in testimonies. And I think it is important to note that the guidelines that exist within these international conventions are guidelines for all member states, regardless of ratification status, right? So the key issues that we have identified in testimonies have also included failure of authorities to follow up with complaints. And these authorities are not just governmental authorities, these are also non-governmental authorities and organizations, so unions or complaint mechanisms in workplaces. Lack of accountability within workplaces, and lack of a mechanism to submit complaints or instances of breach of contract under violations of rights in the workplace, which has turned out to be a challenge, especially for migrant workers from the testimonies that we heard. Issues with understanding languages and local cultures were also raised, which we think importantly intertwined with a lot of the issues that were raised within testimonies that were brought. So there have been concerns regarding ratification that we discussed during the jury working group, and more importantly, the effective implementation of treaties that these countries have ratified, and that the countries in question from which these victims come from and are working in. So the testimonies shared by witnesses have also laid the bare minimum and the important gaps in national legislation and the gaps in measures to operationalize the international and national norms and standards in place for protection of women workers. So in general, we saw a trend of lack of trust in public authorities. Do we speak up or not? Is it safe to even complain about something as basic as a human right? Have caused many of the witnesses not to seek help or protection from public authorities, such as the police or the judiciary. And we think that the systematic barriers that exist within these areas then are that of stigmatization, of specifically gender-based violence, that of lack of trust, and lack of repercussions for perpetrators. Because if we speak up, is there going to be any effect to that? Or is it just going to be of no use, right? So we think that these were the important things that were raised within testimonies that we have identified as being important when we begin with thinking about systematic barriers. The second thing that we wanted to highlight was that all countries that are concerned under the testimonies that we went through within our jury working group have ratified international treaties, at least of some sort, if not all of them, that provide for basic rights to women workers, such as CEDAW, but serious concerns include the implementation of those ratified. So all the relevant states have ratified these conventions, which are fundamental to human and labor rights. The testimonies presented suggest that these states are not complying with the conventions. So this includes non-compliance with a lot of other treaties, such as the Convention on Rights of Migrant Workers, or the Convention C-190, which has also not been ratified by a lot of states. And we think that this is one of the structural barriers that, even though there is a trend of progressive realization that exists within women in terms of approaching authorities or approaching, say, like our collaborators to speak up about their rights, is stopping them from actually accessing justice. So I want to specifically also highlight the barrier that exists when states haven't ratified the C-190 that I just mentioned, which I think was also a trend that we noticed. I think the reason why that is specifically important is that because a lot of the testimonies that we went through specifically get covered, a lot of the harms and the rights violated specifically are covered within the Convention on Rights of Migrant Workers, especially those that relate to abuse by taxi drivers, transport home late at night or after night shifts that were presented at the tribunal. So we think that that is particularly important. And I think Jackie will focus on them a little bit more when she talks about the recommendations. But I think it is important to note that even if C-190 hasn't been ratified, the conventions noted above and the ratification of even the most basic conventions or even of CEDAW for member states do prohibit discrimination against women migrant workers, where such discrimination is on the basis of gender, race, or ethnic or national origin, which is again important because even though some of these conventions have been ratified, their implementation seems like a systematic barrier. In terms of identifying structural and systematic barriers to justice, we thought that there were still important gaps in international norms and standards towards unpaid domestic and care work that was seen as quite a trend between the testimonies that we had heard. The lack of international standards is concerning. The lack of international standards for workers in the informal economy also leaves workers in general, we thought, and women workers, who make up most of the informal workers in particular, extremely vulnerable. And this was quite highlighted within the testimonies that we heard, and not just within the testimonies that we heard within our jury working group, but also in other jury working groups. Furthermore, I think the stigmatization that I was speaking of before in terms of lack of recognition of sex work as work and the stigmatization combined with the nature of the work being so open to gender-based violence, including sexual violence, we think exacerbates the harmful work for condition of sex workers, which I think, again, will lead to direct recommendations that we would like to make in terms of stigmatization and the kind of rights that these women workers should have. So finally, before I hand it over to the next jury working group, I want to say that the testimonies that we went through also showed clearly the ever-rising need for a binding treaty on business and human rights, because the current lack of accountability that we saw on part of private sector and the lack of systems to effectively monitor and remedy human rights. And these are basic human rights, like not violating your contract or just having basic workplace conditions where you feel safe. These are exacerbated by the private sector, which I think should also be held accountable. And we think that this is one of the root causes for the gender-based violence at the world of work that we identified within these testimonies. I hope that helps and gives you an insight into the things that we went through. And I know I'm running over time. Thank you so much for attending this session today. And I will hand it back to Pravin.
Thank you so much, Prasasti, for your presentations. And thank you for the jury working groups members of the thematic area of gender-based violence for all of your hard work and for pulling through all of that summary that Prasasti just present just now. I just also would like to remind everyone, participants as well, that please hold on to any interventions that you may have, because we will have another open sessions for interventions or any other discussions at the end of today's event. I would just like to move on to our second thematic area, which is on care work, protections, decent work, and also formalizations. And within this jury working group members, we have Rola Segayer, Dr. Tonya Haynes, Radhika Balakrishnan, Priyanti Fernando, and also Raya Gomez as the members of the jury working group. And for this first sessions of the presentations, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Tonya Haynes to present the summary from the jury working groups. Thank you.
We protested twice in front of Government House and went to Parliament to submit our demands for relief. We ran a campaign where almost 200 sex workers mailed their high-heeled shoes to the government with messages attached demanding the authorities take responsibility. This campaign by high-heel defenders turned into an art exhibition and protest at the Bangkok Arts and Cultural Center. 11 of us prepared to file a lawsuit against the Prime Minister and authorities. During the struggle, we also gathered to distribute what food and supplies we had in 11 provinces to over 1,000 sex workers. We started a community garden on vacant land. We had clothes swaps and other activities to cut costs and make some money. I open with the words of one of the witnesses who offered their testimonies to highlight that women workers across the global South are organized, fighting back, and creating more equitable forms of community and care. The Jury Working Group for Care Work, Social Protection, Informalization, and Decent Work heard 13 testimonies at the Global Tribunal on Women Workers from witnesses and representatives from Thailand, Hong Kong, Bangladesh, Philippines, Cambodia, and Latin America and the Caribbean. The categories of workers covered in the testimonies were broad, ranging factory workers, parlor workers, seafood processing workers, sex workers, domestic workers, migrant workers, and street vendors, whose clear analysis of the violations they struggle against highlighted several cross-cutting and intersectional issues which broadly violate several human rights and labor standards in the rubric of decent work. These issues require urgent attention. Feminist activists and scholars have long established that women's unpaid care work underwrites the entire capitalist economy. Women's gendered and disproportionate responsibility for care also limits our ability to participate in paid work and often frames and structures the kind of paid work available to us. Example, domestic work, informal and precarious work. In addition, this fundamental devaluing of women and the work that women do is linked to gender-based violence, harassment, low wages, weak provisioning of social protection, and fragmented or weak regulation of many of the sectors in which women predominate as workers. Women's responsibility for the economic, affective, emotional, and physical care for others, the lack of income and social safety nets which recognize the value of care work, propels women into work which is often precarious, poorly paid, or characterized by harassment or stigma. We also heard that women workers employed informally are often tasked with providing unpaid domestic care to the dependents of their employers, who themselves lack access to childcare. Throughout the tribunal, we heard from Dalit women workers, for instance, from Bangladesh, for whom the caste system is at the root of the human rights violations which they face. Issues of forced and early marriage, intergenerational poverty, lack of access to education and housing, social and economic exclusion, hunger, lack of access to healthcare and sanitation are due to the structural and systemic violences of the caste system. Women's experiences reveal that unequal relations of gender are inherent in the caste system and work to sustain it. Even the jobs as cleaners reserved for Dalits are precarious, without contracts, access to social security and personal protective equipment, and do not pay a living wage. Unequal relations of gender compound Dalit women's experiences of violence as they face sexual violence with a complete lack of access to justice, as well as other forms of gendered harassment. The result of this is a total dehumanization of Dalit women and a denial of their human, civil, political, and labor rights. The testimonies lay bare the structural violence and injustice of the caste system, which excludes Dalits from most categories of work, including paid domestic work, condemns entire communities to salaries which are unlivable, and to precarious conditions of work and inhumane living conditions. In the absence of a complete abolition of the system which negates the humanity of so many, the calls for adequate housing, appointment letters for cleaners, a living wage, as well as pension, social security, paid maternity leave, and sickness and death benefits must be urgently implemented. Migrant domestic workers are also vulnerable, even in countries with more robust regulatory frameworks, such as Hong Kong. The regulation of migrant domestic work, which ties their migrant status and contracts to a single employer, leaves them vulnerable to harassment, violence, and other labor violations, not only without redress, but at risk for deportation if they take action against employer violence. The result is that migrant workers are forced to choose between enduring violence and harassment or risking deportation, debt, and loss of livelihood. We also heard from sex workers in Thailand and Latin America and the Caribbean. As many sex workers are also heads of households with sole responsibility for children and elderly relatives, policies which recognize and remunerate care work are at the heart of redressing this fundamental gender injustice. Even where national legislation requires enrollment of all workers in Social Security, as is mandatory under the law in Thailand, only around 5 out of every 100 sex workers are enrolled. Sex workers are often forced to pay certain fines if they violate de facto rules in their workplace, a gendered form of wage theft, in addition to not receiving sufficient social security protection. The Red de Mujeres Trabajadoras Sexuales de Latinoamérica y del Caribe demands labor rights and social protection, highlighting that police officers, security forces, and state functionaries violate the very rights they're supposed to protect due to weak governance and the marginalization of sex workers in the economy and society. For transgender sex workers, transphobia compounds these rights violations. One of the witnesses, a fish processor, who describes herself as a militant worker who has survived in this exploitative society by struggling in various ways, called attention to sexist discrimination in a gendered division of labor where men are paid more. A system of reliance on middlemen for employment denies women workers the right to union representation and to protest and entrenches discrimination. Women's bodily autonomy and safety is also compromised when no provisions are made for the accommodation and transportation of workers forced to labor at night for no additional pay, and in the absence of a national minimum wage. The result is a labor history marked by child labor, wage theft, intimidation, lack of occupational safety, sexual violence, and injury. Of course, women are fighting back, mobilizing and organizing around a shared understanding of their rights as women and as workers. One of the witnesses, a factory worker, fought back. She filed a case with the National Labor Relations Commission in the Philippines and won a favorable judgment, which was never enforced. After a tenure as a factory worker marked by 12-hour shifts and 72-hour weeks, no rest, theft of wages, despite the existence of a minimum wage, denial of government-mandated benefits such as social insurance, health, and housing, being paid less than male workers, and being forced into unpaid domestic work for her employer, the lack of enforcement of decisions which recognize women's labor rights compounds these violations. As Guyanese women's organization Red Thread wrote in a different context, we are tired of paper rights. We are tired of being abused, violated, and not being able to get justice. Gendered norms that inhibit women's access to the public sphere mean that women's right to work is often contested. Women workers are sexualized and stigmatized for being in public, and this leaves them vulnerable to harassment on the factory floor, the fish processing plant, or the streets. Women's very right to be and exist in public is denied. Testimonies from street vendors in Thailand reveal the gendered battle for space to ply their trade. Women in the informal sector who mobilize their entrepreneurial skills to support their families see their vulnerability compounded by the denial of their right to public space, even though they had been vending since childhood. Those informally employed by others labor without the right to sick leave or sick benefits, and with an ever-expanding roster of tasks based on the whim of their employers, without adequate rest, leave, or fixed hours of work. The witnesses have denounced the informality, precarity, violence, and lack of labor rights, which characterizes work histories that begin as early as 7 or 11 years old. They have asserted the value of the caring work they provide to their families and its contribution to their country's economies. They have offered trenchant analyses of the caste and gendered relations of power, which are at the root of the abuses they experience. They have shared their strategies for fighting back and made clear their demands. To the Global Tribunal, I hope this initiative will contribute to changing the lives of women workers in my country and all over the world. I hope that your recommendations will get the attention of duty bearers. This is in the words of one of the witnesses. To the duty bearers who are here today, all the witnesses are listening and awaiting your action and answer. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tonya, for that very powerful summary and for very sharply and aptly highlighting the value of intersectionality that the Global Tribunal was built upon, because no two women workers face the same discriminations given their varying layers of identity. So once again, thank you so much for that. I would now like to introduce and call upon our jury working group on the health rights of women workers, including mental health, occupational health and safety, as well as sexual and reproductive health and rights. In this group, we have Shanti Dairiam, Allegra Walter, Achali, and Ankita. I would now like to hand over the floor to Achali to present the summary of her jury working group. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Praveen. I'm first going to share my screen. Okay, I hope it's visible to everybody.
I'm so sorry, Achali, if I just may butt in, apologies, but just a quick note to, once again, a gentle and kind reminder to all our speakers today to please speak slowly and clearly so that we can aid our interpreter colleagues in interpreting. Thank you so much. And apologies, Achali, back to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Praveen. I hope my screen is visible to everyone.
Yes, it is.
Yes, thanks for confirming, Praveen. I echo Tonia's request to the duty bearers, and I request them to listen in if they are in the audience with us today. And I also would like to join my co-presenters in thanking the organizers, collaborators, and all the workers who testified. I'm Achali Kumarage, a member of the jury working group on health rights. Like Praveen said, our group had 3 other members, Shanti Dhairyam, Allegra Walter, and Ankita Ramgopal. Our work focused on health rights, including occupational health and safety, mental health, sexual and reproductive health, and rights of the workers. So on behalf of my jury working group, I'll be delivering our determinations on the key issues, trends, and structural and systemic barriers. And my colleague Allegra will present our recommendations in the next session. Let me move on to my first slide. I will be first presenting to you some context to the testimonies that we heard. Over 70 workers from across the global south testified before this tribunal, and our group considered specifically 10 testimonies for the determinations and recommendations that will be presented today. And as highlighted before, testimonies overlapped with other thematic areas, and I will refer to them where necessary. Workers from 7 countries in Asia and Africa, including Thailand, Namibia, Uganda, India, Jordan, Vietnam, Taiwan, and South Korea testified before us in 2 hearings on the 26th of September of 2020. These women workers were from varying industries, ranging from domestic work, healthcare, sex work, garment and manufacturing industries, and home-based industries such as fishnet weaving. They represented both formal and informal sectors of employment. These women workers who appeared before the tribunal and work in the informal sector are recognized as workers, and they are entitled to the protection of their human rights. International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is ICESCR, under its Article 7, extends the right to protection of health and safety in working conditions, including the safeguarding of the function to reproduction to new categories of workers, such as self-employed workers, workers in the informal economy, agricultural workers, refugee workers, and unpaid workers. On that note, I'm moving on to the issues and trends that we identified in our testimonies. The key issues and violations flowing from the testimonies that we heard are considered now, and I will unpack these under 5 key themes that are displayed on the slide. Before we focus on the testimonies and the rights violations under these 5 aspects, I'd like to outline the overarching rights framework within which we considered the testimonies. All of the core international human rights treaties encompass a right to work in just and favorable conditions. Article 23 of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, enshrines everyone's right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Article 7 of the ICESCR includes the right to safe and healthy working conditions. Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is the CEDAW, in its Article 11 holds that women workers on a basis of equality are entitled to the right to protection of health and to safety in working conditions, including the safeguarding of the functions of reproduction. Most notably, International Labour Conference in June of 2020 in June of 2022, which is this year, recognized a safe and healthy working environment as a core right in ILO's fundamental principles and rights at work. This means that all ILO member states commit to respect and promote this fundamental right, regardless of having the relevant conventions ratified. Almost all the states that we named, or rather that were named during our hearings, are members of the ILO. In addition, the UN General Assembly, by way of a resolution in July of 2022, declared a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a universal human right. So in addressing the highlighted issues that I'm going to recite, we deem the right to a safe and healthy working environment as intricately interlinked with other human rights and human existence. Now I'm coming to deal with the 5 aspects on the slide. The first theme, occupational health and safety. It's a co-ILO right and is elaborated by 3 key ILO instruments, which are Promotional Framework for Occupational Safety and Health Convention of 2006, Occupational Safety and Health Convention of 1981, and Occupational Health Services Convention of 1985. Workers testified with photo evidence of hazardous use of chemical substances, toxic workplace environments, noise and air pollution, reckless handling of chemicals and other substances, and the non-provision of personal protective equipment at work. And this included a home-based fishnet worker from Thailand and 2 migrant workers based in Vietnam, both working in factories, and 1 worker in particular working for a big brand. These concern violations and indication of duty bearers under ILO's Working Environment Convention of 1977 and Chemicals Convention of 1990. In the testimonies, workers presented violations of workplace machinery, equipment, chemicals, and other substances, and risks and adverse effects on workers' health under articles of the above named conventions. It was really shocking to hear that big brands acting irresponsible about their manufacturers in the supply chain, even when there are enforceable legal standards against violators and continuous activism around this issue. Moving on to the second key issue about migrant workers. Several of workers who testified in our hearings were migrant workers and submitted evidence on occupational health risks. Article 2 of the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families, which was adopted in 1990, encompasses a broad definition of who a migrant worker is. It recognizes multiple rights and safeguards that should be accorded to migrant workers who are legally residing or engaged in work by the states parties. These protections apply during the entire migration process of migrant workers and members of their families, which comprises preparation for migration, departure, transit, and the entire period of stay. The ILO Migrant Workers Convention of 1975 addressed questions of irregular migration and explicitly incorporated reference to application of the fundamental human rights norms embodied in the instruments of the UN Bill of Human Rights. The jury would also highlight intersectionality as an essential reality in the violations concerning migrant workers working outside their home countries. Next theme is maternity rights. Article 25(2) of the UDHR stipulates that motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. Article 10(2) further recognizes protection for mothers before and after childbirth. CEDAW in its Article 11 on discrimination in the field of employment emphasizes the right to protection of health and safety in working conditions, including the safeguarding of the function of reproduction. And Article 11(2)(d) highlights the need to provide special protection for mothers at work. The testimonies highlighted how this right was violated when the workers were one was a domestic worker and the other was an undocumented migrant worker. In the first instance, the violator was her employer, who was a private party, and in the second instance, by the state law enforcement authorities in her host country. The next theme is sexual and reproductive rights. The jury recognizes the worker's choice to use of contraception has been violated in one of the testimonies. This was by forcing it on a migrant worker by a recruitment agent without adequate information to and the consent of the worker. Forced contraception is a violation of Article 11 and 16 of CEDAW. The final theme is violence against women. Violence against women workers was a common theme across several testimonies, and it's an aspect of the health and well-being of women workers. While this is more fully dealt by another jury working group who went before us, we will only consider some limited instances flowing from 3 testimonies that were directed to our jury working group. We highlight that under CEDAW's general recommendation number 12 and 19, rights and freedoms of workers include just and favorable conditions at work. It is discriminatory when a woman has reasonable grounds to believe that her objection would disadvantage her in connection with her employment, such as a hostile working environment. Testimonies by workers referred to violence against women and its short and long-term impacts on them as people and as workers. Overall, the jury noted continuous neglect of issues involving women workers, feminization of informal industries and intersectionality that placed women workers at a neglected point of disadvantage. And these were key themes common to all the testimonies that we heard. The impacts on workers are both short and long term. There was absence of legal protections and non-implementation of national and international standards by both state and non-state actors was quite prevalent in the experiences that we heard. Therefore, we as the Jury Working Group for Health Rights acknowledge the physical and mental harm caused to the workers and the significant physical and mental costs and economic loss the women workers had to bear as consequence of their rights violations. The full extent of our deliberations will be submitted to ERO to be presented to the duty bearers, and thank you very much for listening in. Back to you, Praveen and Vivi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Achali, for your presentations of the key issues. I would also like to echoing what Praveen mentions on the importance of intersectionality, and as what Achali presented, the highlight of the key issue itself, the one that was drafted by the Health Rights Jury Working Groups also shows that no matter what is the sectors and also countries of these women workers came from, we can see the vulnerability of not just violence, but also neglect that affect their not only physical, but also mental and psychological health. That unfortunately remain rampant. I would just like to move on to our next presentations from the third thematic duty working groups, which is on freedom of associations, collective bargaining, and the rights to unionizations. We have Urmila Abdullah, Nasma Akhtar, Maha Abdullah, Archana Kotekcha, and also Zoe as part of the jury working group members. And the first session will be presented by Urmila. And Urmila, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vivian. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Euro Asia Pacific in particular, for this opportunity to participate in the jury working group. And I'd also like to specifically sorry, it seems my video was not on. I hope it's on now. I'd also like to specifically thank the other members of the jury working group, and in particular Zoe, for excellent work on these recommendations and on our findings. As the jury working group on freedom of association and collective bargaining and the right to unionization, we commend and salute the brave women who testified for shedding light on hospital workers cleaners, domestic workers, and garment workers in their struggles across different parts of the global South in realizing their fundamental human and labor rights in the world of work, in particular, the right to freedom of association and collective bargaining. We heard testimonies from workers from the Philippines who were illegally terminated for trying to organize a trade union, through to garment workers in Vietnam and Bangladesh, as well as workers in Pakistan, working in the seeking remedies for health and safety violations, and workers from Malaysia who were hospital care workers, workers in the entertainment industry, in Nepal trying to organize following a dismissal for, trying to organize a trade union following dismissal for such activities, as well as domestic workers in Malaysia who were Filipino and not prohibited from participating in and organizing workers. We also heard from sex workers in Thailand reporting vicious reprisals and victimization as a result of their activities relating to form to create some sort of collective voice. So we heard various testimonies under the theme of freedom of association, collective bargaining, and the right to unionization, which reveal not only the failings of legal frameworks and state actors, multinational corporations, and national businesses with their human and labor rights and duties, but also the impunity of local suppliers and factory management for gross violations of fundamental and human rights, fundamental human and labor rights of women workers. We heard experiences of harassment, victimization, intimidation, threats of violence to women, including gender-based violence, discrimination involving rampant discrimination against transgender persons, and instant dismissals as a punitive measure against workers seeking to associate with trade unions. Many workers reported vicious reprisals when they sought to organize, as well as legal prohibitions on certain sectors such as domestic migrant workers organizing in Malaysia. All the workers testified to infringements of the freedom of association and collective bargaining right, and these were entrenched in gender-based violence, gender-based discrimination, pay inequalities, and violations of reproductive rights, amongst others. Outsourcing, for instance, of hospital cleaners was seen as a specific strategy by states to undermine and prevent unionization, resulting in both victimization, intimidation, and extreme precarity for workers, as well as manifesting various forms of gender-based violence. Workers were often left with little or no access to remedy or recourse when their demands were met with hostility and retaliation from employers, who we heard, for example, from workers in Bangladesh, even at times enlisted criminals outside the workplace to stamp out any trade union activity and to commit acts of violence and threats of violence against workers. In many cases, workers were prohibited from forming their own representative organizations, for example, in Bangladesh, and forced to join committees created by employers. In addition to the listed violations and adverse human rights impacts, the denial of workers their right to freedom of association through unionization and collective bargaining, enshrined in international law and instruments, have had a serious short and long-term impact on workers' conditions and their well-being. The rights violations in this context are often also accompanied by violations, as we saw in the testimony, of the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to work and livelihoods, the right to freedom of assembly, the right to enjoy just and favorable work conditions, and the right not to be discriminated against in employment and occupation on arbitrary grounds. In turn, these violations contribute to exacerbating an already fragile, impoverished, and at many times inhumane living conditions to which workers are subjected due to structural and systemic inequalities and discrimination. Many workers who gave testimony spoke about various struggles and imposed realities as a result, ranging from gross harassment on the grounds of transgender status to precarious work contracts that affected their livelihoods. Impoverishment, difficult living conditions, literacy, and a lack of rights awareness all contributed to accepting poor and unfair working conditions. In many cases, these working conditions amounted to forced labor, such as we heard from garment workers in Vietnam. Dismissals were key and ongoing practices used by employers to distract and control workers, especially women workers, and prevent them from grouping and unionizing and engaging in other related activities. Despite these activities being legal, as it appeared that most of the countries under consideration had ratified the key ILO conventions, Convention 98 and 87, relating to collective bargaining and freedom of association. Inherent to the unbearable working conditions of women workers as a result of their inability to unionize, we saw aligned the poor enforcement of labor laws and labor standards and various gaps in compliance with international UN and ILO standards. And even where these standards had been ratified, there were difficulties with the enforcement and practical implementation of national laws giving effect to these rights and obligations. We also noted that there was key power structure and asymmetry between workers, employers, and authorities, as well as multinational corporations, which hindered the ability of workers to exercise their rights and to seek justice and remedy for those rights violations. And what we saw was a continued role of strengthening those in power and authority, be it the multinational buyers and global brands sourcing from factories where garments are produced, or those in government or factory management itself. The last point is that the gaps in compliance with international legal obligations as member states of the UN and the ILO, and the lack of access to effective and adequate remedies for the rights violations experienced by women workers, we've also seen as being indicative of systemic and structural impediments to gender equality and women's human rights in society as a whole, which then manifest in the work environment. And then simply just to add a last point, if I still have time, I apologize if I'm out of time. We noted that there were rights violations under Article 20 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 22.1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as Article 8 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In addition, we noted violations of Article 11 of the CEDAW Convention, as well as many international labor organization conventions related to the right to organize, freedom of association, and collective bargaining, but in particular, the Freedom of Association and Protection of the Right to Organize Convention number 87, and the Right to Organize and Collective Bargaining Convention number 98. And these extreme violations simply highlight the difficult situation of women workers in securing environments that respect decent work and that contain implementation and enforcement of all the internationally ratified conventions related to freedom of association and collective bargaining. Thank you. That is the statement of the jury working group in relation to the first part of this event today.
Thank you, Urmila, as well as the jury working group on freedom of association, right to unionization, and collective bargaining. As I've said, and as we keep on saying, the freedom of association is a cornerstone to the women's rights and labor rights movements as the basis to demand for any and all of their rights. So once again, thank you for that brilliant summary and sharing that with us today. Now, I would like to introduce, for the first session, our final jury working group to present their summary of their thematic area, which is our jury working group on wage equality, living wage, and equal pay for work of equal values. In this jury working group, we have Oh, apologies, my timer went off. In this jury working group, we have Amelia Reyes, Chansita Mark, Sarut Zai, and Vishnavi. I would now like to call upon the speaker on behalf of this jury working group, Sarut Zai. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of my jury working group, whose members you have already been told, these are some of the pleas, the heartfelt pleas that we heard from our witnesses. We are human. Women's work is real work and not an easy job. Please hear me. We found that it is impossible to discuss wage inequality, a living wage, or equal pay for work of equal value without taking cognizance of the conditions that people work in, or the fact that certain industries and jobs are located only in the global south. Some occupations and professions have become so feminized that the International Labour Organization Equal Remuneration Convention of 1951 does not adequately address the concerns of the workers in the global south, and new definitions of wage equity are required urgently. The JWG envisions a definition that will, amongst other things, cater for migrant labor and the increased casualization of workers. This is workers who are on short-term contracts. And the coming up with a definition has to be collective, taking into account the deep-rooted norms and structures of the patriarchal and capitalist society, which views and values work, in particular women's work, through the lens of oppression. We also noted a worrying lack of monitoring and enforcement of adherence to the laws regarding employees' safeguards and rights by the authorities. We noted that there was a systemic failure by the state to respect and protect the rights of workers and women, and failure to hold the private sector and multinational corporations accountable for labor exploitation. It was also clear to us that there is an unwarranted discrimination between professions, such that professions such as those in domestic work or in entertainment are not given the same recognition and protection as other professions. In a broader sense, it is evident that the current extractive capitalist system, driven with the sole purpose of growth and profit, is the origin of the structural inequalities that women workers in the global south face. A collective sense of justice and solidarity is needed to comprehensively address the multidimensional challenges such as those faced by our witnesses. We noted certain common issues. For example, on wages, there was either no minimum wage set, or what was paid to the women workers was lower than the set minimum wage. There were limited or no benefits, including maternity benefits and access to reproductive health care. There was excessive working hours and excessive production targets, termination of employment contracts without cause and without following proper procedures, or not paying the terminal benefits. And there was also no rights or space for workers to be heard in the workplace and for their concerns to be addressed. And there were no mechanisms to address rights violations and grievances. We also noted the use of child labor and discrimination against old women workers, and not giving effect to girls' and women's fundamental rights, such as education, health, national resources, including equal access to land. The common trends that we noted included contractualized, informalized, and fragmentation of work with or without rule and regulation. The enforcement, monitoring, inspection, and reporting is limited or absent. The lack of the absence of seeing the whole chain of production or work, and rather just in segments, privatization of basic commodities and services, and the power then goes to the hands of the private sector and the multinational corporations. Loan and debt are used as a means to trap workers in exploitative conditions and to silence the workers' solidarity or actions of solidarities. I think I will go now. The full report obviously will be available, but I wanted to just quickly go to some of the structural barriers that we noted, systemic and barriers to justice. We noted that there is a lack of a definition of what wage equality or a living wage or equal pay for work of equal value means. There is lack of an objective definition of what a minimum wage is. Lack of recognition of certain categories of work as work at the same level as other categories. For example, domestic care workers are not given the same safeguards as other workers, that is minimum wage, paid leave, and so on. There is an absence of bilateral agreements between the sending states. This is relating to migrant workers, the sending states and receiving states, which exposes migrant workers to abuse. At the local level, we found that there is an unequal gap in access to opportunities, services, and jobs between rural and urban spaces, which leads to unwanted migration and the isolation of women workers from their communities of origin. The fragmentation and trivialization of women's work, which is often classified as easy and unskilled work, leads to employers paying women wages that are not enough to live on and are often below the legislated minimum wage, and this in turn increases the gender wage gap. In most industries and countries, there is active discrimination against women workers who are older or who have a disability. This then forces women to cling on to jobs where their work is undervalued and underpaid because their opportunity of getting work elsewhere is diminished because of their age or disability. There is no framework for recognizing or remunerating the care work done by women in looking after not only their own families, whose members may then be freed to engage in paid labor, but also in looking after the community and its natural resources. There's no social security or welfare for people who are not included in the paid labor matrix or whose work is not recognized as work. We found that the root cause of macro level vulnerabilities is that it is telling that certain industries are only located in the global south and have become feminized. There is also increased migration of workers, in particular domestic workers, and increased casualization of workers. This enables corporations to get away with not paying a living wage, with governments in the global south being complicit in these practices by not ensuring that the laws are adhered to, or by setting up special economic zones where profit is priced above people. Dynamics such as the race to the bottom on wages ensure that corporate tax abuse and illegal labor practices, while the global north countries benefit from the extraction of time, labor, and resources from the global south. As one witness mentioned, they are forced to work under precarious conditions under the economic growth rationale, while the benefits are not felt by them who genuinely generate value, not for their communities or regions, but for the global north. The dynamics of debt from the individual to the national and regional to the global impose a violent cycle that undermines the quality of life of services and of opportunities. So these are some of the issues and barriers that our jury working group noted. I will leave it to Chansita to later on go on to the recommendations that we came up with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Saru, for your presentations of the wage equality thematic group. And I also would like to say thank you once again to all of the jury working groups members that has worked so hard in drafting, and not just drafting, listening and paying attention, and eventually drafting the recommendations that we are hearing today. Saru's presentations on the wage equality thematic group will be the end of the first sessions of the recommendations from the Global Tribunal of Women Workers. But before we move on to the second sessions of the recommendations, I would like to give the space back to my co-facilitator, Pravin, to introduce us to the next creative sessions. And Pravin, the space is yours.
Thank you so much, Vivi. And once again, thank you to all our jury working group members for your summary. During the course of the Global Tribunal and within our bigger event of the Global South Women's Forum, we have constantly stressed on the importance of art in spaces such as these. One, of course, to balance out the intensity of the witnesses and their testimonies and the violations of rights that we face, but also, and equally importantly, the importance of art as sources of activism and organizing and collaboration within the women's rights and labor rights movements. We would like to share with you a music video by one of our artists who also performed for us and hosted a session during the Global South Women's Forum. The music video we have today is Equality for You and Me, which was a project between our artist Maggie Katigbak. Maggie is from the Philippines. She is a women's rights advocate, researcher, and artist. She's currently doing her master's in women and development at the University of Philippines, Diliman. Her research interests include women, women's labor, women's economic empowerment, and women's economic empowerment. She also currently works as a HR generalist in the private sector. In her free time, she teaches yoga. The music video we have today is titled Equality, You and Me, and was a collaboration between Maggie as well as the International Trade Union, specifically their Asia Pacific branch. The song was inspired by women and young leaders of the trade union movement in Asia and the Pacific region, and their issues and demands, their aspirations and vision, and their collective action to fight for an equal future for all. So I hope you enjoy the video we have lined up. Thank you, paging our tech team to help us with that. Thank you so much.
Day by day, women are silenced, facing fear, intimidation, and violence, robbing us of freedom and security, rooted in centuries of patriarchy. We want a life with dignity, a world that upholds rights and equality. Hatred and violence have no place, regardless of gender, class, or race. Equality for you and me, this is our aspiration. An equal future for women, girls, all people of every nation. An equal future with decent work and employment. A world of work free from violence and harassment. Let's make this vision a reality. Equality for you and me. This is a world we can fight for, a world worth struggling together for. Let's rise together. shared prosperity. It'll save millions of lives, empower all workers to thrive. Fight for a world where all are free, where there's no sexism and misogyny. Equality for you and me, this is our aspiration. An equal future for women, girls, all people of every nation. An equal future with decent work and employment. A world of work free from violence and harassment. Let's make this vision a reality. Equality for you and me. Give us a seat at the table. Give voices to workers, women, and young people. We must have a say in policies affecting our lives. Their design, their enforcement must leave no one behind. End gender-based violence and discrimination. Ensure social protection, decent job creation, social dialogue, and engagement with unions. Build a nation grounded on inclusion and people's genuine participation. Ratify C-190. This is our demand. Governments, employers, and unions, now is the time to band, to protect us, shield us, and make us safe from violence and harassment that we, the workers, face. We are workers, not slaves. Make the world of work safe. Equality for you and me.
Thank you. I would just like to once again say thank you so much to Maggie, as well as the International Trade Union Congress, for this amazing piece of art and for this very, very powerful song with an extremely powerful message to protect women workers, to fight for their rights, and to ratify the ILO Convention 190. Thank you, Maggie, once again, and thank you all for the overpouring love and solidarity and support in the chat. With this, we will be taking a brief 10-minute break. So it is now 8:42 in Kuala Lumpur. We will return in 10 minutes, which is 8:52 in Kuala Lumpur. But of course, we will have a timer to help you with that. So thank you so much, everyone. Please stick with us. We do still have 2 sessions. One is when the jury working group members will be reading out their recommendations, as well as a brief open floor discussion. With that, thank you, and we will see you in 10 minutes.
subscribe to my channel. And also press this bell icon.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the recommendations day of the Global Tribunal of Women Workers. And Thank you for staying with us. And before we begin our second sessions of the recommendation, I would like to invite all of us to watch a short documentary video, 6 minutes to be precise, from Surya Women's Development Center. This a short documentary called Carrying Hens that shows the conditions of women's work in the informal and care economy in Sri Lanka. The video is in Tamil but has English subtitles. So without further ado, let's watch this documentary together. And for a tech team from Stractive 8, if you can help us to show the video, thank you very much.
நாங்கள் வேலை செய்ய தோணுமாள் 30 வருஷம் இருக்கும். எங்களோட பிள்ளையெல்லாம் சின்ன சின்ன ஆக்கள். நாங்கள் போய் எடுத்து வேலை செய்யக்குள்ள காலையில் நாங்கள் 3 மணிக்கெல்லாம் கிளம்பி மட்டி அவிக்கிறது எல்லாம் ஆயத்தம் பண்ணி எடுத்தாங்கன்னா தண்ணியை குடிச்சிட்டு மட்டியை வச்சு கொட்டினா நாங்கள் அந்த பார்த்து காலையில் 8 9 மணிக்கெல்லாம் கொண்டு போய் வியாபாரத்துக்கு போய் வந்தால் நாங்கள் சமைச்சு சாப்பிட்டுட்டு மட்டி எடுக்க போவோம். போயிட்டு 7 மணி 8 மணியாக போவாங்க 2 வாரத்துக்கு எங்களுக்கு வந்து சில நேரம் சமைச்சு வச்சோம்னு சொன்னால் சமைக்க மாட்டோம். இல்லைண்டா கடையில் எதுவும் சாப்பாட்டை வாங்கி சாப்பிட்றோம். நாங்கள் இப்போ இடம் மாறி எடுக்கிறோம். இப்போ கொஞ்ச நாள் இங்கே மூத்துவாரம் எடுத்துனாங்க. அங்கே மட்டி முடிஞ்சுது. திரும்ப கோரியல் எடுத்துனாங்க. அங்கேயும் இல்லை மட்டி. திரும்ப வந்து உப்போடைக்கு போய் எடுத்துனாங்க. அங்கேயும் இல்லை. அப்புறம் சும்மதாங்கி பாலத்தில் எடுத்தோம். அங்கேயும் முடிஞ்சுது. இப்போ எடுக்கிறோம் சேர்த்து கூட ஆகல.
வாயழைக்கிற வேலை நான் 10 வயசு பிள்ளையிலேருந்து வாயழைச்சிட்டு இருக்கேன். 50 வருஷம் 50 வருஷம் இந்த தொழிலை தான் செய்துட்டு இருக்கேன். நான் வேறு தொழில் செய்யலை. நான் இப்போ வாப்பா அந்த பண்பாயில் தந்ததுக்கு பிறகு 15 வருஷ காலமாக நான் அந்த பண்ணை வெட்டிக்கிட்டு இந்த குடும்ப செலவையும் பற்றிக்கிட்டு நான் இருக்கேன். கிழங்க பிடுங்கி நாட்டணும். நாங்கள் 10 வருஷம் 5 வருஷத்துக்கு ஒருக்கா பிடுங்கி நாட்டணும். இந்த கிழங்க பிடுங்கி நாட்டினாங்க. அது பிடுங்கி நாட்டினா விளைய நாள் செல்லும். எப்படி நாள் செல்லும்? 6 மாதம் 1 வருஷம் போகும். நான் 10 மணிக்கு இடையில நான் ஒரு 4-5 மணி பாய் இழப்பேன். இழைச்சி அதை தூக்கி வச்சு போட்டு நான் சோறு கறி ஆக்கினி பிள்ளைகளுக்கெல்லாம் கொடுத்துட்டு நான் திருப்பி ஆரம்பிப்பேன். ஆரம்பித்து 5 மணி மட்டும் என் தொழில் செய்து முடிப்பேன். பின்னரம் நான் காலையில் 5 மணிக்கு ஒழும்பி பின்னர் 5 மணிக்கு நான் தொழில் முடிப்பேன். 100 கத்த புல் வாங்கினோம்டா நாங்கள் அதுக்கு ஒரு 20 பாய் இழப்போம். 20 பாய் இழைச்சா நீ அதை விற்று போட்டு தான் நாங்கள் வேறு வருமானத்தை எடுக்கணும்.
எங்களுக்கு தொழில் செய்ய இயலாது. மட்டிக்கு போக இயலாது. எந்த உதவியும் கிடையாது எங்களுக்கு. இந்த சைக்கிள் உடஞ்சி கிடக்கு எங்களுக்கு அதை நேராகிறதுக்கு இப்போ என்ன செய்யறேன்னு தெரியாமலுக்கு யோசிச்சு தருவாங்க. இப்போ அதுக்கு இப்போ பெச் போட்டு எடுக்கணும், டயர் வாங்கணும், டீப் வாங்கணும். இப்போ வாங்கினா தானே நீ அதை கொண்டு போய் தொழில் செய்யலாம். நடந்து போய் வாரண்டா கஷ்டம் சென்று போகல பஸ்ஸில் போகலாம் சில நேரம் பஸ்ஸுக்கு காசு இல்லைன்னு சொன்னால் நேரம் சைக்கிள் எடுத்து இறங்கி நடந்து தான் போகிறேன் கொஞ்சம் தூரம் நடப்பேன் கொஞ்சம் தூரம் சைக்கிளில் போவேன் அப்படியே இறங்கி நடந்து போய் வர்றதுக்குள்ள நடந்து தான் வரணும்
பாரசாங்க வேலை செய்கிறவங்களுக்கு பென்ஷன் வரும் இப்போ எங்களுக்கு எதுவும் இல்லையே நான் 50 வருஷம் தொழில் செய்துட்டு இருக்கேன் 50 வருஷம் தொழில் செய்துட்டு இருந்தால் 60 வயசு ஆகுது எனக்கு 60 வயசுக்கும் எனக்கு பென்ஷன் சம்பளம் எங்களுக்கு என்ன எதிர்பார்ப்பு உதவி ஒன்று இருக்கு உதவி ஒன்றுமே இல்லை எங்களுக்கு அரசாங்கத்து உதவி எதுவுமே இல்லை அப்போ எங்களுக்கு ஏதாவது ஒரு உதவி செய்யத்தானே
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching the video with us. We will begin the second sessions of the recommendations. And this time we are going to have presentations of key recommendations by the 5 thematic jury working group members that we heard earlier as well on categories of national and international policy and legal frameworks, access to justice, enforcement and implementations, coordinations, regulation and monitoring, and other non-specific recommendations. And without further ado, I would like to invite the first thematic jury working group members, which is on gender-based violence. And in the second sessions, the presentation will be presented by Jackie Pollock. Jackie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So the testimonies given during the Global Tribunal clearly indicate that the lack of protection of women workers in their home and outside the home lead to critical deficits in decent work and increase women's workers' exposure to sexual and gender-based violence and harassment. Working in the informal economy without labor and social protection particularly places women in danger of GBV. The testimonies highlighted how employers abuse this precarious situation of workers and use physical, sexual, and psychological violence to punish and control women. The testimonies have led us to the conclusion that domestic violence and the lack of recognition of the unpaid and unrecognized care work women do in their own households is a root cause of the lack of recognition of the paid work they do outside the home. And it is a causal factor to women workers experiencing GBV in paid work sectors. Without a care income, women have few options in their choice of work, having to take work according to the hours, location, and transportation, instead of being able to choose according to the working conditions, job satisfaction, and work environment. The tribunal recognizes the care work that mothers and other women do in the household as work, contributing to the economy and well-being of the country, and which should therefore duly be paid for by the state. The jury working group commends the courage of all the witnesses in sharing the experiences of GBV and notes with appreciation and admiration that while witnesses sought individual remedies, all witnesses expressed that the intention of sharing their experience was to bring about systemic changes to ensure that other women did not have to suffer the same abuses. The GBV Jury Working Group would also like to note the important role that non-governmental organizations played as frontline responders in supporting women to access justice and in recovering from their trauma. Without the NGOs and support groups, most of the witnesses would still be enduring abuse today, or would be struggling to gain a livelihood without having had any chance to access justice, healing, and support. Therefore, our recommendations are as follows. We call on governments in consultation with unions, women's groups, and migrant women's groups, employers, and recruitment agencies to legislate to ensure the full development and advancement of women, and to address discrimination against women in education, employment, economic, and social activities, as outlined in CEDAW, including in General Recommendation 19 and 35 on violence against women, and Recommendation 33 on women's access to justice. We call on the governments to review and amend laws and policies to prohibit GBV in the world of work, including development of complaints mechanisms, monitoring, remedies, and sensitivity training, as well as ensuring that women can remove themselves from work situations which are a danger to their well-being without suffering retaliation, in line with the ILO Convention 190. We also call on governments to amend laws which specifically exclude some sectors of women's work from labor laws, especially domestic work and sex work, where sex workers are criminalized by current laws, to immediately repeal these laws to decriminalize sex work, and for domestic workers to review and amend laws in line with the ILO Convention 189 on domestic workers. We call for governments to extend social protection to all workers in the informal economy and develop policies to transition the informal economy into the formal economy, as per ILO Recommendation 204. We also call on governments to provide care incomes directly to the principal carers of children, the elderly, mentally and physically disabled in their own households. Taking into consideration the long-term impact of SGBV on victims, which due to mental or physical abuses result in women being unable to do paid work for long periods of time, we call on governments to ensure that women are fully compensated for these periods of time, whether it be through reparations awarded through court procedures and employment or disability benefits. Considering the multiple barriers to accessing justice detailed in the testimonies, which include gender and racial prejudices, fear of reprisals, including violence, loss of jobs, social stigmatization, and in the case of migrant women, deportation, we call on governments to take immediate actions to remove such barriers, including public campaigns on equal rights to justice, accessible complaints mechanisms, including interpreters where needed, free legal aid, provision of safe shelter if needed, protection from reprisals, including witness protection and whistleblowers protection, and taking action against corruption and abuse by law enforcers. To the business sector and other employers, we call that all employers adopt zero tolerance policies for SGBV in the workplace. Considering the number of testimonies relating to the abuse of women on transport to and from workplaces, especially at night. We call on employers to put policies in place which include safe transportation and flexible working hours to diminish the risks of abuse during travel. We also call on employers to develop workplace policies and sanctions which explicitly address staff in positions of power and authority who abuse this power to threaten, abuse, and harm women workers. And to develop workplace policies to mitigate the impact of domestic violence, including provision of paid leave and protection from dismissal for victims of domestic violence, flexible work arrangements, and protection for victims. This is in line with the ILO recommendation 206. In terms of access to justice, business sector should take certain measures to ensure greater access to justice, including supporting SGBV focal points to educate and raise awareness in the workplace, development of complaints mechanisms with training on SGBV, conducting regular monitoring and inspection, ensuring protection from dismissal or retaliation for reporting cases, and putting sanctions into place for perpetrators. The business sector should also coordinate with independent bodies to provide non-work-based access to justice mechanisms. Our recommendations to trade unions are that we ask trade unions to review their union's constitution and all collectively bargained agreements to ensure they contain clear language and guarantees against SGBV in the world of work, including safety planning, paid leave for survivors, protection from retaliation, and access to adequate support systems such as legal representation. Trade unions should raise awareness of SGBV among union members and support the development of skills, especially among women workers, to negotiate workplace policies. National and international trade unions need to proactively promote women's participation in unions, including supporting women to run in union elections for leadership positions. We encourage unions to form alliances beyond union membership with women worker groups, including domestic workers and sex workers. It is also essential for labor unions to connect globally and establish agreements that address SGBV in the world of work in countries that are key locations for the investment of global capital. We also call on unions to initiate or join campaigns to call for the ratification of Convention 190. In our last set of recommendations, we're making recommendation to multilateral agencies. Particularly, we call on the UN agencies to take a coordinated and consistent approach in terms of principles, standards, and policies on the rights of women workers, particularly in regard to women workers in the informal economy, and to include global representation of women workers, especially sex workers and domestic workers, in deliberating on UN positions, particularly in regard to UN Women's position on sex workers, and for greater inclusion and of these underrepresented women workers in the annual International Labour Conference. We call on all multilateral agencies to promote trainings, support, and financial assistance for the NGOs which provide frontline services for women workers, ensuring that the agency's support that they give is long-term and adaptive to the conditions in each country and does not discriminate by excluding unregistered but verifiable organizations or discriminate by excluding undocumented migrant women and sex workers. And finally, to us all, we must work together towards a world of work which is free of SGBV violence, so that no woman will ever have to say again, as one of our witnesses had to say to her lawyer, "You want evidence? See my body. The scars and the injuries are my evidence." Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie, and for the jury working group on gender-based violence and ending gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work for that powerful, powerful, powerful set of recommendations. Something that we noticed during the tribunal, as well as the testimony collection process, and even while trying to fit the theme of gender-based violence across the different hearings that we had, you would have known that we faced much trouble because we can't categorize GBV. We cannot allocate it to specific themes because the gender-based violence against women workers is such a pervasive and egregious violations of the rights of women workers, which exist in every single one of our thematic areas. So thank you once again for your set of recommendations and for the work of your jury working group. Thank you, Jackie. And now we move on to our next jury working group, which is our jury working group on care work, social protection, decent work, and informalization. With that, I would like to invite Rola to present. Thank you, and to you, Rola.
Thank you, Pravin. As mentioned, my jury working group has worked on recommendations for care work, social protection, and informalization. These are terminologies that we borrow from the economic sector, and women workers and blue-collar workers in general have been historically excluded from these conversations, as if economics and as if care work, as if social protection is a duty solely in the hands of duty bearers such as governments or professionals outside of the people whose lives are immediately affected by it. Therefore, when we think of the care economy and people working in the informal sector, they are both providing care, but also on the receiving end of care. We have heard their testimonies, and we would like to note that whenever workers or worker movements make demands to governments and employers, we often hear the narrative of rights versus responsibilities. And this framework is flawed, as it portrays workers, employers, and states as equal sides when the relationship is both de facto and de jure uneven, as we have seen in the testimonies. While human and employment rights overlap, workers endure breaches that transcend the immediate employment provisions. Consequential statements such as one must work in order to get paid or in order to get cared for fall short from describing the context that women workers navigate. The women workers we have heard work and get their wages stolen. Their basic care needs are not met. Some of them have been starved to meet a particular weight to keep their employment. These are basic care needs. This is beyond a breach of an employment right. It is an outright starvation, purposeful impoverishment, and even attempted murder. These are human rights. Therefore, we made a set of recommendations in relation to basic provisions and agreements of international standards to be met. These are the universal agreements such as the Declaration of Human Rights, in particular, the recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal inalienable rights of all women, all workers, all people. The CEDAW Convention as well is a widely ratified one. However, it is being continuously breached as testified by the witnesses. In particular, the General Recommendation number 12 and 19, the rights and freedoms of workers that include favorable conditions at work, because decent work is part of the care economy, and social protection is how that could be most immediately achieved. Also, we have made recommendations to pursue the standards described in the Global Compact on Migration, albeit this is not a binding legislation. It is one that looks into the cycle of migration and provides guidance to decrease the challenges faced by migrants. Governments therefore must re-evaluate their migration processes beyond bilateral agreements alone into international standard setting. And the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which guarantees the women the right to work on an equal basis and equal rights at work with men, should be met as well. As for the ILO conventions, we have made recommendations in relation to the 11 fundamental conventions in particular. I will not reiterate what my sisters have mentioned previously, so I will skip through some of them. The freedom of association and the protection of the right to organize, the right to collective bargaining are absolutely essential if we are serious about giving a seat at the table for women workers. Forced Labor Convention, the 2014 Protocol, and the abolition of forced labor of 1957 also must be reconsidered in relation to practices that are reminiscent of forced labor, such as in the inhumane hours that were tackled in the testimonies, such as not having contracts whatsoever, such as working extensive hours that are unpaid. These are forced practices that need to be challenged. Then another key convention is the convention number 111 on the discrimination in accordance to employment and occupation, as well as the Occupational Health and Safety Convention that nowadays got elevated to a more core status, and that is a victory of worker movements as well. Transition from the informal to formal economy recommendation number 204 provides guidance to the establishment of a comprehensive social security system to ensure that everyone has access to essential healthcare and basic income security. Nonetheless, we ought to remember that it is the precarity that creates informality and not the other way around. So essentially, we are not fighting informality as an end in itself. We are creating policies that should not combat the workers of the informal economy, as regularization pathways should not be the only way to gaining rights. The reality is a lot of workers in the informal economy are unable to access these regularization pathways because at times they require additional economic burden that cannot be borne, which means that the policies need to be designed with these needs in mind. The International Convention on the Protection of All Migrants and Their Families, in addition to the Convention of 1975, the supplementary provisions that are applicable to migrants who are with an irregular status. Care should not be conditional upon the migration status or the regularity status of a worker. Convention 181 and the accompanying recommendation on private employment agencies is also important because women workers are often recruited through private employment agencies, especially within the migrant care chain or the global care chain. Another recommendation we have made is in relation to C-190, which has received ample coverage. The importance of this convention is that it is cross-sectoral. So it is a stellar example of how it would alleviate injustice across sectors, the various sectors that have testified. And of course, Convention 189, the Domestic Workers Convention, that stipulates that domestic work is work, and that stipulates the protections that need to be afforded under it are essential for domestic workers to enjoy equal treatment and equal rights as afforded to other workers. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination is also widely ratified by 182 countries. However, we have heard testimonies in relation to Dalit women, in relation to other forms of racial and caste discrimination that prove that even though this convention dates some 50 years ago, it is still unmet by the widely ratified number of countries. In terms of access to justice, we need to make sure that sex work and human trafficking are not conflated in legislation, that the policies are designed with the needs of sex workers in mind, or with them present, or with evidence with the positive impact of such policy on sex workers' lives. We need to decriminalize sex work and include in that decriminalization sex work for one's own account by recognizing it as a profession and extending protection for the workers. Likewise, we need to decriminalize the irregularity of the migration status, specifically for blue-collar professions, to include regularization pathways without making them the sole path towards rights. And while the situation of precarity is often created by the employer, workers are the ones to be persecuted and criminalized, whether in a situation created by the end of an employment visa, as we heard in one testimony, or by the de facto bar rules that sex workers fall under in Thailand, for example. All of this jeopardizes the safety of the worker while safeguarding the employer's economic interests. So workers cannot access justice systems because justice systems frequently protect those in power, and they need to be re-evaluated, as well as the burden of proof needs to be re-evaluated, as my sister earlier mentioned, that workers' bodies are the proof, workers' lives are the proof, as we see in this tribunal. In terms of enforcement and implementation of a more caring economy for women workers, we ought to adopt the 5R framework when reforming the care economy sector, specifically recognize and represent the workers. On an infrastructural level, governments need to revisit the fiscal policy in each country. As we have heard in the opening of the tribunal session, the women workers who testify are from the Global South, work in the Global South, and experience the consequences of colonialism, including indebtedness, that translate into fiscal policies of the countries where they work. And it affects the context of their employment through austerity measures that imposed dating to colonialism. Women workers are marginalized fractions of workers, and they should not be bearing the cost. We need to ensure a truly intersectional gender analysis, including race, citizenship, sexuality, gender identity categories in economic policy design. So when economic policies are designed for care departments in governments, they need to involve workers at the table, but also not work in a siloed manner. Fiscal policies must be transformed to give adequate investment into care, to restructure tax systems to move from regressive consumption that punishes people who bear the care burden or the care penalty, that are impoverished throughout their lives because they perform jobs in the care sector. Governments must provide more equitable opportunity for worker continuous education and have a department responsible for implementing policies associated to care. We also recommend a greater role for the Ministry of Labor in terms of redistributing the authority, especially in criminalizing contexts, from the Ministry of Interior or Immigration Services and other systems of policing in order to attend to the workers' needs as opposed to penalize workers. Finally, women workers who have testified have provided us also with the answers, with the policy suggestions that we have relied on to make our recommendations. The mechanisms that we have listed are available. They have been shouted at the top of the lungs of the workers, but they are not pursued to their transformative extent. There is an issue of implementation. It is not news. So women workers have been making these demands for decades, and the right to care should not be a privileged luxury of the few, but the very fundamental right of all workers. I hope that duty bearers can carry this plight, because women workers have done so for centuries and continue doing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rola, for that very powerful recommendations from the jury working group members. And thank you so much for all of the hard works that you and also your team has been working on to draft these recommendations. The third thematic jury working group that will present right now is on health rights, including occupational health and safety, mental health, sexual and reproductive health and rights of the workers. And it will be presented by Allegra Walter. Allegra, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Fifi, and all the committees. On behalf of the Health Rights Jury Working Group, we would like to present on our recommendations. We would like to thank all of the survivors of the women workers who have come forward to testify and share their story courageously. So for introduction, we would like to separate our recommendations into three main duty bearers. That includes the employers, states and government bodies, community, civil society organizations. Recommendations for employers. First of all, we would like to address on the hazardous substances and also toxic environment. That includes complete information on the danger and health impacts of all toxic and hazardous substances used in factories, along the importance of training in the proper safety management of the chemicals and the equipments. Provision and preparation of proper equipment for workers handling toxic chemicals and or being exposed to harmful fumes. Maintenance and safety checks of the equipment and machines on factory premises. Factory premises to be built to facilitate ventilation and ensure minimal toxic exposures to workers inside the factory. Regular health checkups for factory workers exposed to all toxic or hazardous chemicals, and also remedies for short or long-term health impacts on workers affected by these toxic and hazardous substances, sustained injuries, or any other ill treatment received at work. The importance of increased transparency and due diligence on the part of the fashion brands, especially in terms of health of informal workers like garment factory workers. Continuing, for healthcare workers, public or private hospitals and clinics should reflect the occupational safety for health workers, which include safe working environment, safe healthcare practitioners and patients ratio, fair pay and working hours, capacity building and training that encompasses all forms of sensitivity training. For health workers, government and non-government and private institutions should provide financial compensation and remedies for overtime. Support for health workers should transcend beyond physical health, but also mental health, including burnout mitigation. For sex workers, employers must not mandate STI testing, but rather promote safe practices and enable sex workers to take decisions informed by their own choice. Continuing, for employers, practicing non-discrimination in the workplace of all forms of gender, sex characteristics, disability status, case, race, religion, health condition, or any other socio-demographic backgrounds, on promoting a workplace free of gender-based violence, health rights violations, and social discrimination. Child care facilities like creches are to be made available in workplaces close to workers who are caregivers. Payment of fair wages according to national laws in place, including payment of overtime, paid leaves, maternal leave, and more. That includes reasonable working hours. Training of workers on their health rights must focus on gender sensitization and other forms of cultural sensitivity training within the workplace. Creation of effective grievance redressal systems to address individual complaints, focusing on gendered issues in the workplace. We are encouraging trade unions to participate in bargaining with management for collective issues of workers with a focus on gender-sensitive topics, reflected in multiple workplace settings that include factories, domestic healthcare, government instances, migrant locations, and others. Continuing to our recommendations for states, that includes the government bodies. Ensuring the national laws are created in line with the occupational safety and health standards internationally established and ratified by the country. To ratify all international laws and instruments dealing with occupational health and safety measures, maternity protection, rights to migrant workers, rights to domestic workers, sexual and reproductive health and rights of women, and other protective legislation for women workers. Ensuring both the private and public sector industries comply with these laws through regular checks and inspections carried out through labor ministries and other relevant government bodies, such as Ministry of Health and other ministries. Organizing training programs for all ranks of management and workers in occupational health and safety standards, navigate wage inequalities, sexual abuse, other health rights violations, gender-based violence in the workplace, and other gendered issues. Strict punitive action against business owners and companies that violate these standards of occupational health and safety measures, labor protection, minimum wage standards, and protective legislation within the labor laws. The extraterritorial obligation of foreign companies indulging in violations of workers' rights within the state's territorial jurisdictions should be attended. Continuing, to ensure easy access to public healthcare facilities for workers exposed to toxic and hazardous substances via their workplace, receive occupational injuries, experience sexual violence, and other ill treatment. To create favorable conditions for trade unions to operate within the state systems as effective tools for bargaining between workers and management. Raise awareness of vulnerable groups of women, such as workers in the informal sectors, domestic workers, migrant workers, and women of minorities from all socio-demographic backgrounds, of their rights under the country's labor laws and under the violence against women laws, as well as under international law. In coordination with civil society organizations, states and government bodies should support systems that can facilitate by claiming women's labor rights, rights to non-discrimination, and personal safety in the justice system. Building the capacity of agencies that receive complaints from women to dispense justice without bias based on gender or socioeconomic status. Taking appropriate penal action against employers or employment agencies that violate the labor and human rights of women workers to reduce impunity. Governments should regulate informal sectors and local employers to bring informal sectors under the ambit of the law. Government, furthermore, should adopt a standalone sexual harassment or anti-discrimination law or regulation for workplaces were not already in place, and promote the rights of women workers according to the international framework and recommendations as reflected through the CEDAW Convention that includes access to equal protection, non-discrimination, freedom of stigma, violence, right to work, privacy, health, economic, social security, and ensuring a safe environment for women. Enable trade unionization of the informal sector through the adaptation of appropriate laws. Strengthen the labor inspectorates to monitor violations of labor rights and dispense justice. Require them to provide half-yearly reports of actions they have taken. Government should help gather data on the dispensation of justice to women workers in the informal sector and monitor trends in violation of their labor rights. Lastly, educate all relevant government agencies on their obligations to women workers under domestic and international human rights law. Furthermore, government has the responsibility to regularize its reporting to treaty bodies and the ILO, include human rights and equality education into the education curricula. Decriminalizing sex work in countries where it continues to be criminalized would maximize the legal protection of sex workers and their ability to exercise their rights in law, health, and social spectrums. All public health measures must be directed to equal rights to the health of survivors, factory workers, domestic workers, sex workers, and other formal, informal workers without discrimination, rather than the surveillance type of mindset that objectifies women and women of minority backgrounds. Research, advocacy, policymaking, and legal interpretative efforts benefit from this more comprehensive understanding of workers' rights to health. For the third section, recommendations for communities, civil societies, and organizations. To regularize research, implementation of occupational safety and health laws while focusing on gendered issues and gauging their effectiveness for workers in factories and other formal and informal industries. To provide information on shortcomings and improvements to government agencies and departments to assist them in making improvements within the existing laws. To provide assistance and information to trade unions to better assist with their bargaining between management and workers on issues concerning women workers. To conduct regular training on gender issues around occupational health and safety for workers, mental health, sexual reproductive health, and other relevant health sectors. Capacity building should target beyond community of sex workers, factory workers, domestic workers, and all other survivors, but should include the healthcare workers, social workers, and law enforcers who interact directly with the survivors. That includes gender-sensitive, trauma-informed training, which will, our belief, will eliminate all forms of institutional abuse. Due to intense stigma, discrimination, and criminalization, survivors are reluctant to seek justice or service when they experience human rights violations. Collaboratively, communities should be involved in monitoring human rights violations, because community monitoring and advocacy can play a significant role in a real-life situation of human rights violations and law implementation. Working with networks of survivors from different backgrounds is crucial in identifying the gaps between health, legal law enforcement, and the actual implementation. Thank you so much for your time and consideration.
Thank you, Allegra, and the jury working group on the health rights of women workers. And thank you for ending on such a powerful call for collective and community action, besides holding duty bearers accountable. And thank you once again for your recommendations. With this, I would like to call upon, thank you, Allegra. Terima kasih. With this, I would like to call upon our fourth jury working group for tonight's session, which is the jury working group on freedom of association. I would like to call Urmila, Urmila. I'd like to call Urmila to present their group's recommendations. Thank you, Urmila, and to you.
Thank you, Praveen. I apologize again on behalf of my fellow jury working group members who are not able to be present today. I have taken the liberty of summarizing the recommendations we had agreed upon, and I apologize to them if I'm not doing complete justice to the full set of recommendations. In relation to the national and international systems, our recommendations are as follows. 1, states that have not done so should ratify the relevant up-to-date ILO conventions relevant to freedom of association and collective bargaining and harmonize their national laws accordingly, which laws should be fully and effectively enforced. In addition, given the violence, threats, and harassment that accompanies anti-union intimidation and reprisals in the garment industry where women workers constitute the majority, ILO Convention 190 prohibiting workplace violence and harassment should be ratified, and the convention and accompanying recommendation 206 should be applied by states. 2, states should adopt and enforce labor laws and policies to give effect to obligations under all ILO conventions related to freedom of association and collective bargaining, but in particular conventions 87 and 98. In particular, national legislation should be amended to provide for organizing trade unions within trade union exempt zones such as the EPZs in Bangladesh, and workers should be allowed to exercise their rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining freely within these zones instead of being forced to join so-called political trade unions formed by employers under threat of dismissal. 3, states should ensure that all national legislation is compliant with their international duties and obligations, for instance, through the rescinding national laws such as the Employment Act of 1995 in Malaysia, where there are provisions that restrict and criminalize workers for exercising their rights to freedom of association. 4, states should exercise greater responsibility over the multinational corporations that are located within their jurisdiction or secure supply from local factories to ensure that they comply with national laws in every country in which they operate and with international human rights responsibilities, such as those under the UN Guiding Principles, the OECD guidelines, and the ILO guidelines for multinational enterprises. They should carry out ongoing human rights due diligence processes throughout their supply chains to identify, address, and prevent violations of human rights in a transparent, comprehensive, and inclusive manner, and ensure access to remedy for rights violations of workers. They should also hold local suppliers accountable for allowing impunity of management for their criminal conduct in harassment and intimidation of workers for exercising their rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining. 5, where the health sector is privatized or certain sectors of the health sector, such as cleaning workers, governments should develop a binding policy or framework for contractors and subcontractors to abide by and reflect in their internal policies and modes of operations, which would include guarantees for all relevant rights and freedoms for these workers. States should also address pertinent violations and loopholes resulting in the workers' inability to join trade unions in these sectors and access justice mechanisms to ensure effective remedy. 6, all workers, and in particular domestic workers, hospital workers, and sex workers who are extremely marginalized and vulnerable to forced labor and modern slavery and unable to exercise their rights protections through forming trade unions, should be protected under labor legislation and afforded their rights to organize and associate freely with trade unions to represent their rights and interests. In the category under access to justice, our recommendations are as follows. One, states should ensure access to effective remedy for victims and those affected, including through national grievance mechanisms, both state-based and non-state-based. In this regard, the relevant compensation mechanisms, such as those recommended by ILO Convention 121, should be accessible to victims and functional. Two, employers should ensure that effective workplace grievance mechanisms exist to enable workers to raise issues arising from their harassment, victimization, and intimidation for trade union activities. In addition, effective disciplinary codes and procedures should exist to ensure that managers who commit conduct which constitutes individual or collective anti-union activity should be disciplined. Three, workers should have access to legal aid and assistance to bring civil and criminal claims arising from abuse and harassment by employer representatives such as factory management. Under enforcement and implementation, our recommendations are as follows. One, government agencies such as in the labor ministries should conduct independent and impartial investigations into incidents of violence and harassment for union organizing, and to hold account all relevant perpetrators and those directly and indirectly involved in the serious violations of human rights and labor standards. Two, global buyers should also be informed about the conduct of factory management and their reliance on local criminal elements to threaten, assault, and harass workers on account of their union activities. They should be forced to denounce such conduct and act against companies and managers who engage in this conduct. Those global buyers operating in exports processing zones, such as those in Bangladesh, should be engaged to support the formation of independent trade unions in these zones. Three, trade unions should continue to build local capacity of women workers on issues of freedom of association and collective bargaining. Capacity building will ensure that workers have an understanding of their rights and responsibilities in both law and practice, as well as effective access to remedy, and are empowered to demand their rights and access to effective remedies. And then we have a number of non-specific recommendations which really relate to action that can be taken by civil society and trade union organizations, which I will not deal with in detail, but which basically assert the importance of raising rights violations in the UN system under treaty bodies, before special rapporteurs, and in the universal periodic review processes, and exhausting all these mechanisms, as well as calling on the Office of the High Commissioner to investigate specific areas where there are particularly rampant violations of women's human rights and labor standards. And then lastly, one of the recommendations is that trade unions should continue to lodge complaints with the ILO Committee of Freedom of Association, protesting the violations of the rights to organize and join trade unions, and seeking investigation of states that are non-compliant. Where states have not fully responded to the ILO supervisory mechanisms, they should be further encouraged to do so. And any failure by a state not to respond or to ignore any recommendations arising from the ILO supervisory bodies should be promptly condemned. This concludes our recommendations from the jury working group. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Urmila, for presenting the recommendations on behalf of the thematic group. And thank you so much for all of the hard work that you and also all of the jury working group members had put to draft the recommendations. The last thematic area is on wage inequality, living wage, and equal pay for work for equal value. However, before we give the space to the representative of the jury working groups members on that thematic area, I would like to remind all of the participants, if you have any questions, response, and or interventions related to the recommendations that was being presented by our jury working group members, please feel free to share them in our chat box and also the question and answer box that is available in your Zoom webinar feature. So thank you so much. So last but not least, let's invite Chansita Mark that will present the second sessions of the recommendations from the wage equality thematic jury working groups. Chansita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vivi. Yeah, on behalf of our jury working group, I would like to deliver the recommendations that we work as a team under the thematic of wage equality, living wage, and equal pay for work of equal value. For the standard and policy, we call on to reform the economic and financial architectures to eradicate the global divisions of labor that depend on the subsidy that the global south is doing to the global north while promoting the precarizations of the life of workers and population in the south. Internationally, to agree on a binding treaty on business and human rights so that there is a real effort to regulate the private sector actions and hold them accountable for their social, economic, and environmental impacts. Recognizing that wage equality goes beyond a binary understanding of equality and must embrace the reality in the global south. We urge for stronger enforcement. Country in which the industry or work are located must coordinate and collaborate to stop corporation from moving from country to country, risk violating workers' rights. State must legislate for and enforce penalty for any form of harassment and harm to employees. Having clear definition what a minimum wage and a living wage is. Stopping the discriminatory practices against certain category of work, such as those in domestic work and the entertainment industry, as well as sex industry. Encouraging and subsidizing workers who do not desire to be shackled in the wage economy. Regulating and effectively controlling the price of the cost of living and the basic commodity and services price in order to ensure the minimum wage set is a living wage. Protections and social benefit and social welfare system for all workers, regardless of where and what work the workers are doing. Encouraging worker participation in decision making by actually listening to workers and acting upon their concern. Continue to protect trade union and their members. For the access to justice, we call on the systemic inspections of workplaces, readily accessible mechanism for dispute and or grievances in the workplace with appeal or review mechanism. Timeless resolutions and dispute and grievances. We also call for the capacitating of the trade unions and offer legal assistance to their members, ensuring that there's no discrimination and harassment against trade union and their member, and continue educations of workers of their rights. For the enforcement implementations, we really actually strongly call for the regular conduct inspections to ensure the compliance of the law on labor and other law related, and take action through official reports and remedy. In particular, for the textile industry, these inspections should take into account the production line and flow from the main factory to the subcontracting factory. Take measure to monitor and regulate the development of operations of sweatshops in the garment industry and put in place mechanisms to ensure registrations and compliance with laws and labors and the protections of workers' rights. Strictly and effectively enforce the existing law on labor and other related law and regulations to ensure the realization and protections of workers and labor rights. Doing so by putting in place capacity and resources and mechanism to implement, monitoring, and reporting the conditions at the workplace. We also call on the buyers and brands to take strong actions and bring factories, subcontracting factories, and sweatshop under regulations and monitoring, and also ensures compliance. For other recommendations, we really encourage the workers to continue to act and also be in collaboration and solidarity. Also solidarity in exposures of exploitations and violations of rights by the employers. We also call the global brands and investors to be accountable and also ensure that employers are being held accountable and that countries are not competing in a race to bottom on wage and the value of work. While recognizing that discriminations and violations of rights of women are experiencing at the workplace, the testimony that we are hearing also highlight the violations will happen at home and during their childhood, including the unable to access to educations of girls, child labor, early marriage, and social and religious norm on the value of work and the role of girls and women at home and in community. Therefore, we also actually call on the address of the systemic and deep-rooted structure that discriminates against girls and women and marginalized at work, in the family, community, religious institutions, state, and also in other geographic location, whether it's rural and urban, north and south, west and east. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chansita, as well as the jury working group on wage equality, living wage, and equal pay for work of equal value. And with that, we actually end the recommendation sessions of the Global Tribunal of Women Workers. I would like to take this opportunity to sincerely apologize to our attendees. I know we were hoping to have an open floor discussion, but unfortunately, due to the rich recommendations that we had and sharing by all the jury working group members, we don't necessarily have the time. But once again, I would like to echo my colleague Vivi's point of please feel free to drop your comments and reflections in the chat for us all to have a look at them. Once again, thank you. And with this, it actually brings us to the close of the Global Tribunal of Women Workers. My heart is so full, yet so heavy that this entire process, which has spanned a total of 6 months, is actually coming to an end for now. So I would just like to say a brief few thank yous, and I'll be passing it over to my colleague Vivi to close us off. So of course, with this, I would like to say thank you to all 22 of our jury working group members for your energy, your expertise, your dedication, your time, your patience, your solidarity, your labor, and most importantly, your love that you've shared with us over the weeks and over the months of your work, of all the meetings that we had, of the hearings, and as well as the Global Tribunal as a whole. And also a huge thank you to all the different moving pieces and to all the different people who have helped pull together the Global Tribunal. And this is to all our 28 collaborating organizations, to the 5 members of our organizing committee, to the 5 members of our security team, and to all our amazing team of 26 interpreters, which have helped us reach an audience that we would never have ever dreamed of reaching with the languages that we have provided. So thank you to everyone. And finally, to finish off my end, I would like to say a genuine thank you to the 73 women workers whose stories we have heard and whose stories were at the heart of the Global Tribunal. And yes, I'm so sorry. I would like to echo my colleague San's thanks to our 4 mental health experts who helped ground us during very intense session. But once again, going back to thanking our witnesses, so thank you for your stories, which were at the very heart of the Global Tribunal of Women Workers and the very heart of our work that we have done over the past months. Thank you for trusting us with your stories and your lived realities. And it was an honor and a privilege to host them and to host you. Thank you from my end. And Vivi, to you.
Thank you so much, Pravin, and thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us, joining us in fighting for the rights of all women workers. And like Pravin mentioned, we may heard 73 witnesses that shared their testimonies. But I'm sure what they share represent the conditions and also the reality of women workers across the globe, and mainly in the Global South. This is why the recommendations from the jury working groups that we hear today will translate beyond sectors, issues, and even borders that we basically heard and also discussed. And we know that once the global tribunal ends, our fight will not end. Our advocacy, solidarity, and also our fights to the fulfillment and protections of women workers' rights will always continue. And to eventually conclude and also close the Global Tribunal of the Women Workers and the Global South Women Forum 2022, I would like to thank you so much, to thank everyone involved in the process of the Global Tribunal, like to all of the witnesses, to all of the collaborators, to all of the jury working groups member, the organizing committee, interpreters, security team, mental health counselors, our tech team as well, and of course, the core team of the Global Tribunal from Euro-Asia Pacific and also Euro-Asia Pacific team as a whole. Thank you so much for all of the contributions, all of the supports that you give to the whole process of the Global Tribunal. So we will definitely see you again in another space in continuing this fight. And that's it from me. Thank you so much. Have a good day and evening, everyone. And I hope to see you again at some point. Thank you.
Thank you all once again.
Thank
Good night from Kuala Lumpur. Bye.
Good
Thank you
night
for
from
joining us.
Indonesia. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Wow. Well done, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Free. Finally, we got to hear your voice.
Thank you.
Thank you.